Well, live from the Chicago Tribune's Printers Row Lit Fest, we are joined by Wes Moore, who is the author of this book, The Other Wes Moore. Wes Moore, who is the other Wes Moore?
The other Wes Moore is currently spending a life sentence in prison in Jessup Maximum Security Facility in Maryland for the murder of an off-duty police officer in a botched robbery of a jewelry store. And I got to know Wes years ago after I first learned about him. And the way I first learned about him was I was actually in South Africa doing a study abroad program while I was a student at Johns Hopkins. And my mother and I were on the phone. And she said, you know, I've got something crazy to tell you. There are wanted posters all over your neighborhood. And the wanted posters are saying they're looking for a man in connection with the murder of a police officer. And they're looking for Wes Moore. And if you see him, do not approach because he's assumed to be armed and very dangerous. And as I came back to the United States, I learned more about that crime and the terrible tragedy, and learned more about who we lost that day. The police officer, who was a 13-year veteran of the police force, was a 3-time recipient of Police Officer of the Year, was a father of 5, and who had triplets. And the reason he was working at that jewelry store was because he was trying to make extra money for his family. And I learned more about the other Wes, the fact that we had so much more in common than just our name. We both grew up in single-parent households. We both were around the same age. We both had troubles academically and also discipline troubles in our neighborhoods. And it really prompted me to want to learn more. So one day I decided to write him a note in prison, and really to my surprise, a month later, I get a note back from Jessup Correctional Institution from Wes Moore, and that was really how the journey began.
How far apart did you grow up?
We actually, we both grew up in different areas within Maryland. Actually, when I was 5 years old, after my father passed away. My father passed away when I was 3 and a half. And then my mother then moved us up to the Bronx, where we lived with our grandparents in a small house up in the Bronx. And the Bronx was fascinating because at that time it was going through a lot of different transitions, particularly in the mid-1980s, late 1980s, with the introduction of crack cocaine and what that was doing to so many communities. And so we spent some time in the Bronx before my mother eventually moved us back down to Maryland. And Wes lived in different communities within Baltimore growing up. But by the time he was actually arrested, we were literally living in the same area within a half mile of each other.
What do you think was the difference?
That was really the question that I wanted to explore inside of this book. And one of the things I realized was there was no one difference. There was no one thing that I can point to and said this was the reason. But there were a couple things that I know played key factors. One is the role of family is just incredibly important in all of this, and the role that family takes on in helping the people within their family go through this journey into adulthood. I think another thing is the role of education and how that played into how exactly, what exactly was expected of the boys, and the role of mentors and role models inside of our lives, and also the role of expectations, I think, played a big deal. I think Wes and I, there's a part in the book where Wes and I are having a conversation, which I think is very telling, where he says, I ask him, I said, so do you think that we're products of our environment? Because we both grew up in pretty precarious neighborhoods. And he says, no, actually I think we're products of our expectations. And I thought that was a very interesting point and a very interesting distinction that he drew out, because he said, if the expectation of a young person or the community that they live in is that this person will grow on to finish high school or finish college and become a productive member of society, be a good father and husband or mother and mother and wife, then that's generally what kids will do. But if the expectation of that young person or the neighborhood, the kids in their neighborhood, is that they probably won't finish school, they probably will end up being involved in the juvenile justice system and eventually will go through the revolving door, the adult prison system, then that's generally what kids will also achieve as well. And so I think the expectations that were placed on both boys and at strategic parts in our lives played a big deal and mattered a lot in terms of how our lives ended up progressing.
Well, first of all, who was Mary? And she's very multidimensional in your book.
Yeah, she is. Mary is Wes's mother, and I think, as with a lot of characters in the book, are very multidimensional. But I think what you fundamentally had in this story were two mothers who really loved their children deeply and cared for their children deeply. But I think Mary first had her first child when she was 15. She later on had Wes when she was 19. Mary was also the first one in her family to go to college. She graduated from Baltimore City Community College and was then actually accepted at Johns Hopkins University and was in the process of beginning the work at Johns Hopkins when she found out that her Pell Grant that she relied on to pay for college ran out. And so once she ended up having those Pell Grants cut, she ended up not being able to attend school. And I can't help but think in my mind how her life could have been different and would have been different had she had the opportunity to finish school, and how then that would have affected the lives of her children as well.
Did she give up at that point? And by the way, we're putting the numbers up on the screen in case you would like to call in and talk with Wes Moore. 202 is the area code, 585-3885 for those of you in the East and Central time zones, 585-3886 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Go ahead and start dialing in now. So, but the scene when she gets that notice about the Pell Grant, you write over several pages, did she give up at that point?
I don't know if Mary gave up at that point, but I know she knew this was a huge blow, because she knew that education was going to be her path out. You know, the streets that she was living in Baltimore were the streets that she had known as home for her entire life. And she looked at the people who she admired in the neighborhood, the ones who ran their own businesses, or the ones who were moving into different areas. The thing they all had in common was they all had education in common. And I think she saw that as her real opportunity to do something different with her life. And when she saw that she was not going to be able to finish school, I think it dealt a significant blow to not just her self-esteem, but just also to her hopes as to what she could and would be able to accomplish.
How would you judge her parenting skills?
I think Mary, just like a lot of parents, just like as my mother will admit, has made mistakes as as she grew up. But I think one thing that Mary had, or one of the challenges that Mary had, was she was raising children at an age where I don't know if even she felt she was even to that point of full adulthood yet. And that becomes a challenge for so many parents, particularly young parents, who are raising kids before they're even fully adults themselves. So I think, as she will openly acknowledge, mistakes were made. And there's things that I think she wished she could have done differently, things she wished she could have done better. But I also know that she cares deeply for her kids as well.
Who is Tony?
Tony is Wes's older brother. And Tony played a fascinating role in Wes's life, and a role not unlike a lot of people who come up in similar type of situations, where it's the older brother who got involved very early in the drug game in Baltimore. Tony was involved in drugs and started dealing drugs and serving as a runner inside of the streets in Baltimore before his age was even in double digits. He was living in the Murphy Homes projects, which at the time was really one of the most dangerous projects in all of Baltimore. And Tony ended up not finishing school any more than 8th grade. But Tony spent most of his young life trying to tell Wes to stay out of the drug game, to stay out of that, because he would tell Wes, he's like, Wes, you're smart. You don't need to do this. And in fact, Wes, if you talk to him now, he'll say one of the greatest regrets he has was not listening to Tony, because I think when Wes looked at Tony, Wes saw someone that he wanted to be like. But when Tony looked at himself, he saw someone that he wanted Wes to be nothing like. And so I think it created a fascinating dynamic in terms of that role model and that intervention that Wes really needed in his life.
And Tony is where now?
Tony actually was the trigger man the day that Sergeant Bruce Prothero was killed, and he ended up getting life in prison without the possibility of parole as well, along with Wes. But Tony died in prison about 2 years ago.
From what?
Tony died of kidney failure, so he started losing a lot of weight, and they realized that he needed a new kidney, but he passed away in prison.
How often do you write to Wes Moore?
I think,
or see him?
Yeah, well, I first met Wes probably a little over around 5 years ago. Was the first time I actually reached out to him, and I say particularly throughout the process of writing the book, I probably saw Wes, once a month, and the key thing was, I mean, when I first started doing this book, I literally captured over 200 hours of interviews with Wes and his friends and family and my friends and family, just to really make sure that I was getting the facts and the feel right, because I really wanted to make sure that the only way I could do this process justice is if I wasn't being judgmental. And the only way that I could do this process justice is if I really got the facts right, in terms of really helping to explain, how does this happen? How does it happen where you have two boys who are in similar situations growing up and end up in two completely different places? And so I knew that meant that I really had to get in it and build that level of trust with Wes as well, which I think I built, and why I was able to really tell the story in the way that I was able to tell it.
And are you still in contact today?
Yes, yeah, I've actually been in contact with Wes and also his family since, and it's interesting because Wes has had two real reactions to the book. The first reaction was, he said it was just amazing how much research that I got done and how I was able to really get the story right after talking to all those different people and really corroborating facts and such. And the second thing that he said about the book was, he said after reading about his life in a book, it's just amazing to him that how little that he's done with his life.